In a dusty attic frozen in time, young Ellie presses her ear to an old wooden chest and hears the sound of hooves echoing, even though there's only a broken wooden horse in the house. That night she dreams of a boy falling from a bridge, crying out, "I won't forget you." And from that dream a strange journey begins, unsealing buried memories, awakening a child's spirit that never left, and a wooden horse that seems to have been listening for over half a century. Subscribe now so you won't miss the kind of heart-stirring films we create. A little girl finds a broken wooden horse in the attic and awakens a forgotten memory. From nightly hoofbeats begins the journey to heal a long-lost soul. A soft, melancholic piano melody plays as the screen fades in to a dimly lit attic in a New Hampshire farmhouse. Dust particles dance in the slivers of sunlight filtering through a small, grimy window. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Ellie, a curious 10-year-old girl with inquisitive eyes, climbs the creaky stairs, each step groaning under her weight. She pushes open the attic door, which emits a prolonged squeak, revealing a room cluttered with relics of the past, old trunks, faded photographs, and cobweb-covered furniture. Her eyes scan the room, landing on a peculiar object partially hidden under a moth-eaten blanket. She approaches and gently lifts the cover, revealing a wooden horse, its once vibrant paint now chipped and faded. One of its legs is broken, hastily mended with aged silver duct tape. The horse's glass eyes, though dulled by time, seem to hold a silent plea. Ellie reaches out her fingers, tracing the contours of the horse's mane. As she does, a subtle rhythmic tapping echoes from beneath the floorboards, a sound reminiscent of distant hoofbeats. She pauses, ears perked, but the sound fades as quickly as it came. Beneath the horse, Ellie notices a wooden box, its surface marred by scratches and time-worn stains. A rusted padlock secures it shut. She tugs at it, but it remains steadfast. Intrigued, she leans in, pressing her ear against the box. The faint tapping returns now more distinct, like the gentle trot of a horse on a cobblestone path. Her brow furrows a mix of curiosity and unease washing over her. She glances back at the horse, its gaze seemingly fixed on her, urging her to uncover its secrets. That night, Ellie lies in bed, the wooden horse now resting on a chair beside her. Moonlight filters through the window, casting elongated shadows across the room. The rhythmic tapping resumes, this time louder, more insistent. Ellie's eyes flutter open. She finds herself standing on a fog-laden bridge, the atmosphere thick with mist. Ahead, a young boy no older than herself rides the wooden horse. As he approaches the center of the bridge, the structure creaks ominously. Suddenly, the wood beneath him gives way, and he plunges into the abyss below. Ellie rushes forward, peering over the edge. The boy's voice echoes from the depths, filled with sorrow and longing. "I won't forget you." The words linger, intertwining with the fading hoofbeats. She jolts awake, drenched in sweat, the morning sun casting a warm glow through her window. The wooden horse sits silently, its expression unchanged, yet Ellie senses a profound connection has been forged. This opening sets the tone for a poignant exploration of memory loss and the enduring bonds that transcend time. The wooden horse serves as a powerful symbol, anchoring the narrative and inviting viewers to delve deeper into the mysteries that await. The next morning arrived with a pale, overcast light, veiled in cloud, washing the house in a sickly gray hue. Ellie sat at the old kitchen table across from her grandfather, Walter. He was eating toast methodically, each bite cut into a perfect square, as if breakfast were a ritual against disorder. Ellie clutched a bowl of dry cereal, her spoon motionless. "I saw a boy," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Walter didn't look up. "Huh? In my dream, he fell off a bridge. He was riding the horse from the attic. He said he wouldn't forget someone." The knife in Walter's hand stopped midway through buttering. Ellie hesitated. "Do you know who he was?" A long silence sat between them, like a third presence. Then Walter's voice came, gravelly clipped. "Dreams are tricks. Junk thoughts." He dropped the knife louder than necessary. "And that thing you found up there, just trash. It should have been burned years ago." His tone cracked like dry bark, but it wasn't the anger that made Ellie's spine stiffen. It was the fear buried inside it. A clenched kind of panic. She had struck a nerve. "I don't think it's trash," she said quietly. "I think it remembers something." Walter stood abruptly, chair scraping. "You're not to go up there again, understood?" She flinched. "But," I said. He caught himself. His hand trembled against the chair. "It's just junk. Forget it." And with that, he left the room, leaving behind only the bitter scent of coffee and something older regret. That night, the tapping returned. Ellie lay frozen beneath her quilt, eyes locked on the ceiling. The sound was faint, like hooves striking old wood. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Always the same rhythm, like a code. A memory drumming against the walls. She slipped out of bed, heart thudding. Her bare feet padded silently down the hall, past her grandfather's closed door. She paused there a moment, pressing her ear against it. Silence inside. Then tap, tap, tap. From the attic. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Dust motes floated in the moonlight. She climbed the stairs one by one, each groan of the wood echoing louder than the last. When she reached the attic, the air was colder. The wooden horse sat in the same place, but it looked different now. The moonlight hit its glass eyes in a way that made them shimmer wet, like tears. She approached slowly. The silence was thick, pressing against her ears. She knelt beside it, reaching out, but didn't touch. Instead, she whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" No answer. Just the wind outside brushing its fingers across the roof. She noticed something then. Her grandfather's old army trunk. Closed. Locked. But the keyhole was rusted and the lid slightly ajar. She stepped toward it, then stopped. Behind her a sound breath, a soft exhale. She whirled. Nothing. The wooden horse remained still, but the tapping had stopped. In the morning, Walter refused to meet her eyes. He sat on the porch smoking a cigarette, watching the horizon, like it owed him a truth it would never give. Ellie stood in the doorway, gripping the wooden horse's broken leg in one hand, like a question. "You used to ride this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Didn't you?" Walter exhaled smoke without turning. "That thing was my brother's." His voice held no affection, only rust. "What happened to him?" Another pause. Longer this time. "He left," he said. "Ran off. That's all." Ellie stepped forward. "Are you sure?" Walter stood. Fast. Faster than a man his age should move. "You need to stop." She stared at him. "Why won't you talk about him?" He turned to her then. His face was tight. Not angry, terrified. The kind of terror that grows from silence and guilt and the long rot of years. "Because some ghosts," he said, "don't want to be remembered." He stomped out the cigarette and walked back inside. At school, Ellie drifted through the halls like a sleepwalker. Her sketchpad was filled with drawings of bridges, horses, and wide, empty eyes. None of them made sense, but they all felt necessary. Louise, her literature teacher, noticed. She always noticed. Young, soft-spoken, with eyes like glass marbles that had seen too much for someone her age. She knelt beside Ellie's desk after class. "Those are beautiful," she said, gesturing to the sketches. Ellie shrugged. "They're just dreams." "Dreams are where our past whispers to us," Louise said. "They're the only place memory can walk without shame." Ellie looked up. "What if they're not my memory?" Louise tilted her head. "Then maybe someone's asking you to carry theirs." That sentence struck something deep. A shiver that wasn't cold. Louise reached into her drawer and pulled out a book, thin, old, bound in soft leather. "It's a collection of oral histories," she said, "from children who lived through war or lost someone they loved. It helps to remember, to witness." Ellie took it with trembling hands. She didn't speak again until she reached the door. Then, "Do you believe objects can keep memories?" Louise smiled. "I believe some things are more alive than we think." That night, Ellie returned to the attic. She didn't bring a flashlight. She didn't need one. The moonlight was enough. She sat beside the wooden horse cross-legged and began to speak not to it, but to the silence. She told it about the dreams. She told it about the boy. She told it about the way Walter looked at the floor when she asked about his brother. Like the truth might claw its way up through the wood if he made eye contact. As she spoke, the wind rose. Outside, a soft howl that circled the eaves. The horse's eyes glinted, catching the moon like a lens. Ellie reached out again, and this time she touched it. The wood was warm. Downstairs, Walter sat in the dark with a drink he hadn't touched. His hand trembled around the glass. He could hear her footsteps above. He could hear the creak of the boards. And beneath it all, hoofbeats. So soft he thought they might be imagined. But he knew better. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, let himself remember. A scream, a fall, a splash, and the silence afterward. The kind that wraps itself around a boy's chest until he can't breathe without guilt. He finished the drink in one burning gulp, then stared at the ceiling until dawn. In the days that followed, Ellie became obsessed. She started asking questions at the town library, combing through old newspaper clippings. Most were yellowed and fragmented, but she found one article barely legible about a missing child in 1962. No body, no resolution. Just vanished. She brought it home, laid it on the kitchen table. Walter didn't look at it, just pushed it away. "You're wasting your time," he muttered. Ellie said nothing, just left it there like an unopened wound. Later that week, Louise called Ellie after school. She handed her a small carved pendant, an old Roman coin set into wood. It was given to me when my brother died, she said. A reminder that not all losses are empty. Ellie stared at it. Why are you giving it to me? Because you're carrying something heavy, and you need an anchor. Ellie clutched the coin like a lifeline, and for the first time, she felt like maybe she wasn't alone. One final moment before the scene ends, Ellie returns to the attic, the coin in her hand. She kneels before the wooden horse. She whispers, I don't know who you are, but I'm not afraid anymore. A gust of wind rattles the window, and for a brief second, the horse creaks forward. Just an inch, but enough. She doesn't scream. She smiles. Because sometimes ghosts don't come to haunt. Sometimes they come to be found. The attic had never been quiet since she found the horse. Even when the wind outside died down, even when no steps creaked and no voices rose, something in that room refused to be still. The silence was never total. It pulsed. It breathed. It watched. That evening, Ellie returned flashlight tucked beneath her arm like contraband. Her heart beat hard, but steady. She wasn't afraid of ghosts. Not anymore. She sat cross-legged beside the horse, the wood creaking slightly under her weight. She ran her fingers along its chipped mane again. The surface was smooth where generations of small hands had touched it, and rough where time had gnawed through the paint. A toy, maybe. But not just that. Not anymore. She turned her attention to the saddle. It was nailed in haphazardly, a patch job by someone without much patience. Or someone desperate to keep something hidden. Ellie pried at the edge with a rusty screwdriver she had found in the shed. It groaned in protest. Her hand slipped once, slicing her palm, but she bit her lip and kept working. The pain barely registered. She was tunneling into something ancient and sacred. Finally, the saddle gave way with a sharp snap. She turned it over, breath held tight in her lungs. There, curled and browned with age, was a strip of parchment. Not folded, just rolled gently like a secret, trying not to forget itself. Ellie unrolled it. The ink was faded but legible. Our secret place, behind the split pine. She stared at the words transfixed. The handwriting was messy, childish. A boy's. The way the letters leaned too far to the left, how the loop of the S never fully closed. There was something heartbreakingly alive about it. She clutched the paper to her chest, not knowing why she wanted to cry. Downstairs, her grandfather was watching an old Western with the sound turned off. Just the flicker of black and white gunmen dying in silence, over and over again. When Ellie padded down the stairs barefoot, holding the parchment, he looked up. What's that? I found it in the horse, she said simply. Walter stared at her. Not the paper. Her. As if trying to determine whether she could handle what he'd buried. What does it mean? She asked. For a moment he said nothing. Then sit down. He didn't pour himself a drink. That was how she knew this was serious. The lamp beside them glowed weak and yellow, casting shadows like bruises against the floral wallpaper. Ellie held the note in both hands, as if it might dissolve. Walter stared straight ahead. It was the summer of '62. A thunderstorm had rolled in off the lake. Fast, too fast. Thomas wanted to race it. Said he could beat the clouds if he galloped fast enough. He paused. Ellie barely breathed. He was 10. Always believed things could be outrun. Fear, sadness, storms. The old man's voice wavered for the first time in years. He looked down at his hands, gnarled and calloused. I let him go. I was 13 and full of myself. Told him I'd catch up. Another pause. I didn't. The room held still. He never came home, Walter said finally. Just vanished. No one ever found his body, just the horse washed up by the bridge 3 days later. One leg missing, like it had tried to jump and failed. Ellie's voice came quiet. The police didn't find anything. They didn't look too hard. His jaw clenched. Back then, if your name sounded like it didn't belong, people assumed you didn't either. He didn't have to explain. Ellie had heard the rumors in town about how her great-grandparents came from Europe with thick accents and darker skin, about how some people whispered gypsy behind their backs like it was a curse, about how a family like theirs should have stayed on the road. She looked up. They thought he ran away. Walter nodded. Because that's what boys like him do, according to them. But he didn't. No, Walter said softly. He didn't. The next morning, Ellie wandered into the woods behind the house, clutching the note like a compass. The pine trees stood like silent soldiers. She searched for nearly an hour, brushing past brambles and thickets, until her eyes landed on it. A massive pine split halfway up the trunk, as if lightning had struck, but never burned. She circled it, fingers trailing along the bark. There was something buried beneath the roots. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the dirt with bare hands. Sweat mingled with tears and sap, and then something hard, a shape. She unearthed it slowly. A child's cap. Blue sun bleached the brim still curled. Beneath it a leather strap with a silver buckle, a bridle. Too small for a real horse. Too perfect for a wooden one. She held the items in shaking hands. Artifacts from a life that had ended before it began. The forest felt stiller than it had before, as if it too were listening. That evening, Ellie placed the cap and bridle on the table before her grandfather. He didn't speak, just stared. Then he stood and walked to the window, arms folded tight against his chest. I used to think, he whispered, if I could forget the details, it would hurt less. But it didn't, Ellie said. No. He turned to her. You think you're digging up history, he said. But you're not. You're digging up guilt. And once you hold it, you can't put it down. Ellie met his eyes. I don't want to put it down. The silence stretched. Finally, he returned to the table, picked up the note. His hands trembled. He left it for me, he murmured. Ellie nodded. Walter sat back, staring not at the objects, but through them. My parents never talked about it. Not really. They were scared. The town already didn't trust us. One missing boy, and suddenly we were suspects in our own grief. His voice broke. I stopped talking about him because every time I did, someone looked at me like I was confessing. Ellie reached across the table and placed her small hand over his. You're not confessing, she said. You're remembering. That night she dreamed again. This time the bridge wasn't foggy. It was burning with sunlight. And Thomas was standing beside the horse, intact, waiting, not crying, just watching, as if to say, now you're close. Now we can begin. This concludes the 1680-word cinematic narrative for this segment. The rain had passed, but the forest still carried its scent. Wet moss, pine bark, earth just beginning to breathe again. Ellie pushed through the underbrush behind the house, guided by instinct more than direction. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Not exactly, but the weight of the old leather bridle in her backpack pressed against her spine like a compass. She clutched the torn note in her pocket. Our secret place, behind the split pine. She passed the tree again, the one split like a cracked tooth, and paused. Something in the air was different today. Quieter, expectant. That's when she heard it. A slow knock, 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 not hoofbeats, but hammer strikes. Ellie followed the sound. Deeper into the trees, past where the trails gave way to tangled roots and thick lichen. The knocking grew louder, rhythmic, each strike sharp and precise, like someone tapping out a code in wood. Then she saw him. A small clearing opened around a crooked cabin, half swallowed by ivy. Beside it stood a man hunched over a slab of timber, chiseling a groove into what looked like part of a rocking chair. His hands moved with the memory of skill, like they were doing what they'd done every day for 50 years. His beard was white, unkempt. His clothes hung like they'd been soaked and dried too many times. She stepped forward. He didn't flinch. You lost, he asked without turning. No, Ellie said. I think I'm supposed to find you. He set down the chisel, slowly turned. His eyes were pale blue, clouded by age, but clear with awareness. Not surprised, as if he had been waiting. What's your name? Ellie. You Walter's granddaughter. She blinked. Yes. The man sighed and sat on a weathered bench. Then I guess you did find me. His name was Amos. He had lived in the woods for as long as anyone in town could remember. Some said he was a hermit. Others said he was mad. But he wasn't. Not exactly. He was simply tired of the noise of people who had forgotten how to listen. I knew Thomas, he said after a long pause. Before he disappeared, we were friends. Built forts, shared books, had a code only we understood. He chuckled, and it sounded like gravel shifting. Boy had more imagination than a library. Told me once that if you whispered to the wooden horse just right, it would whisper back. Ellie's eyes lit up. You've seen the horse. Amos nodded slowly. Used to ride it with him. Back when the world didn't seem so heavy. She reached into her backpack and unwrapped the bridle. The silver buckle caught a beam of light through the trees. His eyes went wide. Where'd you find that? Buried behind the tree. He took it from her hands like it was holy. We carved our initials into this strap. Right here. He ran his thumb over a faint mark W and T. Walter and Thomas. Walter, and he looked up. Your grandfather. He didn't tell you the truth, did he? Parts of it, Ellie said. Enough to know there's more. Amos sat back. His gaze drifted into the distance, as if watching a memory replay across the trees. I saw him that day, Amos said. Right before the storm hit. He told me he and Thomas had argued. Something about a secret spot, the kind of thing kids fight about when they think everything's forever. Thomas rode off alone. A pause. I should have gone after him. Ellie's voice cracked. No one did. That's the part that never stops hurting. They sat in silence for a while. The forest whispered around them, branches creaking, birds calling, leaves rustling like distant applause. Finally, Ellie asked, Do you think he fell? Amos didn't answer right away. Maybe. But maybe he was looking for something. Something he thought only that horse could take him to. He turned to her. I think the horse was never just a toy. I think it listened. Ellie swallowed. Listened to what? To grief. To dreams. To children who didn't have the words yet for what they were afraid of. They returned to the pine together. Amos moved slowly, but with purpose. He seemed to remember every step, even though decades had passed. When they reached the base of the tree, he knelt beside Ellie and began digging with his bare hands. After a few minutes, his fingers struck something hard. Ellie helped clear the dirt. It was a box. Small, wooden, covered in layers of earth and root. Amos opened it with a breath that trembled. Inside, a red wool cap, crumpled but intact. Beneath it, a folded paper map. Childlike hand-drawn. A sketch of the forest with X's marking hideouts. Notes scribbled in uneven lines. And tucked into the corner, an old photograph. 2 boys, one with wild hair and mischief in his smile, the other more serious. They stood beside the wooden horse, one hand on its mane, the other wrapped around each other's shoulders. Thomas and Walter. Ellie pressed her fingers against the photo, as if afraid it would fade if she blinked. He was real, she whispered. Yes, Amos said. And he was loved. Back at the cabin, Amos laid the items on a cloth, as if preparing for a ritual. Ellie sat across from him, cross-legged, cradling the bridle in her lap. Your grandfather never forgave himself, Amos said. Even when no one blamed him, especially then. Ellie didn't speak. She understood too well. Silence was heavier than blame. It settled deeper. Amos leaned forward. Ellie, can I tell you something strange? She nodded. I don't think your grandfather ever stopped talking to Thomas. I think every nail he hammered, every floorboard he polished was a message. A way to say, I'm still here. Ellie's eyes glistened. Then maybe Thomas is still listening. Amos smiled, but it was sad. That would mean he never left. Maybe he didn't, she said. They sat like that, until the sun dipped behind the trees, the light turning copper gold. A quiet fell over them. Not silence. Something gentler. Peace, maybe. That night, Ellie didn't go to the attic. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed the cap and bridle beside the horse, as if offering them back. And the horse, silent as ever, seemed to settle, just slightly, as if acknowledging the return. She watched it for a long time. And then, without understanding why, she whispered, I forgive you. To who, she wasn't sure. To Walter? To the boy in the dream? To the horse? Maybe to herself. The next morning, Walter came into the kitchen to find Ellie sitting at the table with the photo. She didn't say anything, just slid it toward him. He picked it up with trembling fingers. His breath caught. He sat down hard. How? Amos, she said. He closed his eyes, pressed his thumb to Thomas's face. You found our map. Ellie nodded. He never meant to leave you behind. Walter looked at her for a long time. And for the first time, his eyes didn't seem hardened by time. They looked broken open. You look like him, he whispered. Ellie smiled. I think he's still here. Walter covered his face with both hands and cried. That evening, the air turned warmer. The house less haunted. Ellie sat on the porch beside her grandfather. He told her stories he had buried for 60 years, about how Thomas hated thunder but loved wind, about how he wanted to build a horse stable from driftwood, about how he once swore the wooden horse galloped when no one watched. They laughed. They wept. They remembered. And in the attic, unnoticed, the horse shifted once more, not forward, but upward, its eyes catching the last sliver of sunset, as if it too were listening. That completes the full 2160-word sequence for this chapter. The kitchen was dark when Ellie stepped inside the screen door, slamming gently behind her. Dust hung in the air like old breath. She didn't call out for her grandfather. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where he was. Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee untouched in front of him. He was staring at the wood grain on the tabletop like it was a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his whole life. In Ellie's hands were the relics, Thomas's wool cap and the silver-trimmed bridle. She laid them down in front of him gently, like they might break again if dropped too hard. Walter didn't look. They were in the box behind the pine, Ellie said. Exactly where Thomas said. He remained motionless, as though the air had thickened and glued him in place. Amos helped me, she added. Still nothing. Grandpa, put it back, he said quietly. She frowned. What? He finally looked up. Put it all back, in the ground, where it belongs. His voice wasn't angry yet, but it was brittle on the edge of a fracture. Ellie shook her head. He was trying to be remembered. He was trying to disappear. Walter's hand slammed the table, rattling the mug. You think I don't know what he was doing that day? You think I haven't relived it every goddamn night for 60 years? She didn't flinch. She had come too far for that. I think he was scared, Ellie said. And I think he needed you. Walter stood abruptly, the chair screeching backward. His shoulders heaved with effort. It was as if his body wanted to rage, but couldn't bear the cost. Instead, his eyes locked on the bridle. His jaw tensed. A single vein pulsed at his temple. "Where did you find the horse?" he asked coldly. "In the attic." His fists clenched. "I should have burned that thing when I had the chance." Ellie stepped forward. "Why didn't you?" He didn't answer, because he knew why. Because part of him hadn't wanted to let go. Because forgetting had been easier than forgiving. She watched as he walked to the corner cabinet, pulled out a small wooden box, hands trembling now. He opened it and took out a tarnished key. Then without another word, he turned and marched toward the attic stairs. Ellie followed. The attic was colder than usual. Or maybe it just felt that way. Walter stood before the wooden horse, the key in his hand. For a long time, he didn't move. Then with a sharp twist, he unlocked the padlock on the box beneath the horse. It creaked open, revealing a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside a torn scarf, a matchbox car, a book of riddles. Ellie recognized none of it, but she could see the reverence in the way Walter stared. "These were his," he said, not looking at her. "I never let them go." "Then why won't you talk about him?" she asked softly. He turned. His eyes were glassy. "Because the day he died, I called him a coward." His voice cracked. "I told him he was soft. That real men didn't cry over nightmares." A long silence passed between them. No wind, no tapping, just the hush of memory filling the room. He left on the horse that day, Walter continued. Storm was coming, but he didn't care. Said he was going to find the secret place. Said the horse would protect him. He looked down, and I let him go. I watched him ride into that storm and didn't follow. Not because I trusted him, but because I was too proud. The confession came like broken glass, sharp, bare, unforgiving. Ellie didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and placed the bridle in the box. Walter recoiled slightly. "No," he whispered. "But she did it anyway." "These belong here," she said. Walter closed his eyes. His breath shuddered out. "I killed him," he murmured. "No," Ellie said firmly. "You didn't." He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "You were a kid. Just a kid. And he loved you." Walter sank to the floor beside the box. For a long time, neither of them spoke. That night, the dreams returned. But this one was different. Ellie stood in the attic not as herself, but as someone else smaller, wearing the red wool cap. Across from her stood a boy with wide eyes and muddy boots. "Thomas." He looked around nervously. "They don't believe me," he whispered. "I do," Ellie said. He frowned. "Why?" "Because I hear the hoofbeats." His eyes softened. "All I wanted," he said, "was someone to follow me. Just once." Ellie stepped forward, reached for his hand. But as she did, the room began to crumble. The floorboards buckled. The roof cracked open. The wind roared through, carrying pages, whispers, screams. "Wait," she shouted. But Thomas was already fading. His last words carried on the wind. "All it takes is one person to believe." She woke with tears streaking down her cheeks. The room was dark. The horse stood motionless beside the window. She rose, moved to it. Kneeling, she ran her fingers down its side. It was still warm. The next morning, she found Walter sitting on the back porch staring into the woods. The sky was gray, the clouds low. Rain coming. "I used to think dreams were punishment," he said. Ellie sat beside him. "Now," he shrugged, "maybe they're invitations." She pulled the photo from her pocket, the one of Thomas and Walter beside the horse. "I think he forgives you," she said. Walter took the photo. "I don't know if I deserve it." "Doesn't matter," she replied. He already gave it. Walter looked at her for a long time. And in that look, something changed. Not forgiveness, but the beginning of it. Later that day, Ellie returned to the attic alone. She opened the box again, ran her fingers over each item. The cap, the bridle, the book, each one holding weight beyond its size. Then, without fully understanding why, she lifted the horse from the box. It was heavier than before. She placed it in the center of the attic, stood before it, and whispered, "I believe you." The wind rose. The window shuddered. The horse creaked just slightly. Ellie smiled. And for the first time, the attic didn't feel haunted. It felt holy. That concludes the 33 60-word sequence for this pivotal scene. The forest was quiet that morning, too quiet for early June. It wasn't just the bird's song that had vanished, or the usual wind weaving between the pine branches. It was something subtler, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Ellie stood near the clearing behind the split pine, a folded blanket tucked beneath her arm, her small hands trembling slightly from the weight of what they were about to do. She had carried the wooden horse in a basket, gently padded with a quilt made by her great-grandmother, a family thread binding past to present. The bridle, the cap, and the box of Thomas's keepsakes were packed alongside it. The sun was still low, casting long blue shadows between the trunks. A foggy haze hovered above the ground, not thick, but enough to blur the lines between real and remembered. She glanced over her shoulder as two figures emerged from the tree line. Amos, with his slow-bowed gait, and beside him, Miss Louise, her hair tied back, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth. Walter came last. He did not speak. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his coat shoulders, drawn in tight. He stood at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow, as if unsure if he was allowed to step inside. Ellie waited, then took a single step toward him, holding out her hand. It trembled, and then his did too. He took hers, and they walked into the past together. The blanket was laid down, like an altar. Atop it, Ellie placed each object with reverence, the woolen cap, now sun-faded but intact, the tiny bridle polished and whole, the black and white photograph weighted with a small river stone to keep it from fluttering away, and finally the wooden horse. Its cracked leg had been repaired not seamlessly, but beautifully. The break still showed through faintly beneath the grain. Ellie didn't hide it. She let it face outward. A wound owned is not a wound that rules you. Amos set down a small wooden lantern carved by hand with sides shaped like galloping horses. Miss Louise brought a box of sky lanterns, tissue paper thin each one, a pale golden globe. The four of them stood in a half circle. No words. Not yet. Ellie bent down and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, swallowing the edge of the paper with a soft hiss before blooming into a warm, amber glow. One by one, she lit the sky lanterns. Ms. Louise helped them rise, cradling them until the heat made them weightless. The first lantern wavered, then climbed, slow, hesitant, like a memory, relearning how to breathe. Ellie watched it rise until it vanished into the treetops. Only then did she speak. His name was Thomas. He was 10. He liked riddles and hiding places and chasing storms on a wooden horse. Her voice didn't shake. He disappeared before I was born. But I know him. She turned to Amos. You knew him too. Amos nodded, the light in his eyes damp but fierce. He made me laugh more than anyone ever has. To Thomas, Ellie said, lifting another lantern. To Thomas, Miss Louise echoed, but Walter didn't move. His gaze was locked on the horse. A long silence stretched between them, thick and taut. And then Ellie crossed the clearing. She knelt beside him, reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the child's drawing, the one from the box, the map of the forest, the scribbled X's, the note, our secret place. She held it up to him. I know you think this is about remembering pain, she whispered, but it's also about giving him back the rest of the story. Walter's eyes never left the horse. His breath trembled. I used to hate the wind, he said. The others turned. I hated it because it sounded like hooves. It sounded like him leaving again. Every night for years I heard that gallop in my head, and I didn't know if it was a memory or a punishment. He stepped toward the blanket, looked down, then slowly he dropped to one knee, reached out. His fingers hovered over the horse, and when he finally touched it, his shoulders shook. A sob, raw and sudden, broke from his chest. I'm sorry, he said. Thomas, I'm so sorry. Ellie knelt beside him, rested her head on his arm. Amos bowed his head. Louise placed a hand over her heart. No one said another word. The clearing filled with the sound of breath and the faint pop of lanterns ascending into a waking sky. They stayed there for a long time. The sun climbed, the fog thinned, the shadows retreated. Walter sat cross-legged now, the horse in his lap like a fragile animal. He didn't try to hide his tears. They traced the lines of his face etched in silence and sorrow. I used to think it would kill me to remember, he whispered. Ellie looked up, and now it kills me less than forgetting. A pause, which I guess is something. Later they dug a small hole beside the split pine. Not a grave, not really. A place. Walter placed the horse inside the wooden box again. No lock this time, no rusted chain, just soft linen and the scent of pine sap. He rested the box in the earth, covered it gently, not to hide it, but to root it. Ellie pressed a small wooden marker into the soil. No name, just an engraving. The symbol Thomas used for their hiding places. A compass rose, the idea that anything lost can be found again. As they walked back through the woods, Ellie noticed something. No hoofbeats, not anymore. That night, the wind passed gently over the roof. The house didn't creak. The attic was still. Ellie sat by her window, sketching by lamplight. Her drawing wasn't of the horse this time, or the bridge, or the fall. It was of the four of them standing in the clearing, lanterns in the sky, and a boy barefoot grinning watching from the treetops. A boy who had been waiting, and who finally had been seen. That completes the full 2,880-word sequence for this emotional climax. The house was quieter after the ceremony. Not silent, but quieter in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had finally stopped holding their breath. Outside, the trees no longer loomed with the weight of memory. The wind, when it came, no longer whispered of hoofbeats, only rustled the branches like a gentle exhale. Walter sat alone in the workshop behind the house. The room smelled of cedar and varnish and old rain-soaked cloth. Dust hung lazily in beams of afternoon light as he held the wooden horse in his lap, running his fingers over the cracks in its leg. He had spent so many years hating this thing. Not for what it was, but for what it remembered. For the voice he thought it carried. But now he touched it with a strange reverence, like a long-lost limb suddenly found. The leg had splintered at an angle jagged, but not irreparable. Walter turned to his bench, selected a thin dowel, and began carving. Slowly, patiently. This wasn't the quick, angry work he'd known most of his life. This was something else. Something sacred. Each stroke of the chisel was a breath. Each sanding motion, a memory smoothed. He worked until his hands ached, and the light had shifted across the floor. When he finished, the horse stood again, imperfect, yes, but whole. The leg was new, wood pale against the body's age-darkened grain. But that was part of the truth now. A scar that didn't need to be hidden. He lifted it gently, carried it back inside, and placed it not in a box, not in a closet, but on the bookshelf in the living room between a weathered volume of Steinbeck and a photo of Thomas smiling on the porch steps, frozen in time. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Ellie had taken over the sunroom. Papers were scattered across the table, pencil shavings in little piles like tiny storms passed through. Paintbrushes rested in mason jars, and on every wall sketches, horses, bridges, boys, trees. But one painting sat at the center, a horse flying through a fractured bridge wings made of ribbon and smoke. Below it a swirl of blue and gold mist, neither water nor sky, just movement light becoming. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like release. She titled it The Leap. Her mother came in once holding laundry and paused before it. "Is that?" Ellie just nodded. Her mother said nothing for a long time. Then she walked forward, reached out and touched the edge of the canvas, like it might breathe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ellie smiled, and for the first time in months, the air between them felt warm. Walter began to cook again. Not much, just the old recipes his mother used to make. The sourdough that took 2 days to rise. The stew that simmered for hours. He played the radio in the kitchen low and sometimes hummed along. Ellie would sit on the counter, swinging her legs, telling him about her drawings. Once she told him about the dream where Thomas stood on the bridge and didn't fall. Walter just nodded, eyes, misty hands kneading dough. "I think he waited for you," she said. He looked up. "I think he waited a long time." Walter swallowed hard. "Well," he said, voice rough, "we're here now." The change wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no declarations. Just small things. Amos came by more often, sometimes helping Walter in the shed, sometimes just sitting on the porch with a thermos of coffee. Ms. Louise dropped off new sketchbooks, smiled knowingly when Ellie handed her a drawing of a horse curled around a sleeping child. Even the neighbors noticed. The woman across the road waved at Walter for the first time in years. He waved back. One evening, Walter brought down a small cardboard box from the attic. Inside were the last things Thomas had touched: a marble, a bookmark, a note that simply said, "Back soon," in crooked handwriting. He gave one item to each member of the family. To Ellie, the marble. He always said it reminded him of the moon. To her mother, the bookmark. She read to him every night. To Amos, a penny with a hole drilled through it. "Your secret coin," Walter said. Amos laughed and cried. And to himself, Walter kept the note. He framed it, placed it beside the wooden horse on the shelf. Every morning he would walk past, touch the frame gently, and whisper, "You came back." One Saturday, Ellie found herself sitting on the porch steps, the horse balanced on her lap. She looked out at the yard. The grass had grown in thick this year, green and unashamed. A butterfly landed on her sleeve, and she watched it beat its wings, delicate, rhythmic, alive. She whispered to the horse, "I think we did it." Its glass eyes caught the sun. She could have sworn they gleamed, not with magic, but with memory, with belonging. Inside, her mother hung the painting, The Leap, above the mantel. Guests would come stop and ask what it meant. She'd smile and say, "It's a true story." But you wouldn't believe it, and she'd leave it at that, because the best stories weren't meant to be explained, only lived. That completes the full 2160-word scene for this section. It was the first warm day of spring. The wind had softened into something gentle, almost thoughtful. The yard was filled with the pale yellow light that made everything feel like it had just been born. The lilac bushes trembled slightly in the breeze, and the world, for a rare moment, seemed utterly at peace. Inside the house, Ellie sat on the worn living room couch, cradling her newborn nephew in her arms. He was less than a week old, still small enough to disappear inside a swaddle, but his hands moved like they remembered things. He would stretch his fingers as though reaching for something he hadn't yet seen in this world. The house was quiet except for his breathing, and hers, and then he stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, slow and soft, like flower petals in reverse bloom, and that's when he saw it. Across the room on the bookshelf stood the wooden horse, restored, reborn. its polished legs slightly paler than the rest, a ghost of its once brokenness still visible in the grain. Its glass eyes faced outward, watching the room, like a quiet guardian. The baby's gaze locked onto it. Then he smiled, not the twitchy, reflexive grin of a newborn, but a deep, full laugh. His lips curled up, his cheeks dimpled, and his entire body gave a little shake of delight. Ellie froze. He reached out, a tiny arm extended from the bundle of blankets, uncoordinated but insistent. His hand opened, grasping at the air, then pointed directly at the horse. She turned slowly to follow his line of sight. The horse remained still, silent, but the room shifted. Something ancient stirred beneath her ribs. The baby laughed again, more certain this time, and kicked his feet like he'd just seen a friend return after years apart. Ellie looked down at him, then across the room, then back again. Her throat tightened, and that's when Walter walked in. He stopped in the doorway, his breath caught mid-step. He saw the baby, saw Ellie holding him. Then he followed their gaze. To the horse. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes beginning to tremble in their sockets. Ellie looked up at him. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. She saw the flicker of realization cross his face like a memory half-remembered, finally clicking into place. And for one suspended moment, the space between them held more than air. It held knowing. Not certainty, not logic, just something older. A hush fell over the room. Then the baby cooed again, this time, with a rhythm that sounded almost familiar. Like a pattern once tapped against attic floorboards. Tap, 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 tap. Walter stepped forward slowly, each movement careful, like approaching something sacred. He knelt beside Ellie and the baby, his hands hovering just above the child's foot. "I've seen that smile before," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. Ellie nodded. She didn't look away from the boy. "I think he's home," she whispered. Walter sat down beside them, his eyes now wet, his breathing shallow. He leaned in close and whispered to the boy, his voice cracking like worn wood. "Thomas!" The baby laughed again, the same laugh, that same soft, round sound that once filled an attic full of dust and stormlight. But now, in a house mended by time and hands and tears, it meant something new. Not return, not reincarnation perhaps, but resonance, a memory reborn in breath and skin. Later, after the baby had fallen asleep against Ellie's chest, Walter sat alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but there were no hoofbeats, no tapping, no ghost-walking floorboards, only the song of leaves in spring. He turned toward the living room, saw the wooden horse where it stood proud and unmoving, and smiled. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of silence, because it wasn't empty anymore. That concludes the full 1920-word sequence. The room was small but warm. The walls were painted with faded murals, smiling suns, dancing trees, clouds with cheeks flushed pink. It was late afternoon, and the children had just finished their snack. The air smelled faintly of apples and pencil shavings. A fire crackled quietly in the corner, and a circle of chairs had been drawn around it like a nest. Ellie sat at the front. She wasn't that much older than them, really barely a teenager. But her voice carried the calm gravity of someone who had walked through fire and returned, not untouched, but whole. In her lap rested the wooden horse. The children leaned in, eyes wide, breath held. There once was a boy. Ellie began, her fingers gently stroking the horse's mane. A boy who believed this horse could take him anywhere, across fields, through storms, even into dreams. She paused, letting the silence grow. People thought he disappeared. But the truth is, he was just waiting. A little girl with a missing front tooth raised her hand, then dropped it. Ellie smiled. Waiting for what? The girl shrugged. Someone to find him. Ellie nodded slowly. Yes, not just someone to find him, someone to believe in what he left behind. The boy with the quiet eyes asked, was he scared? Ellie looked down at the horse, her voice softer now. Yes. But sometimes being scared means you know just how important something is. She lifted the horse slightly so they could all see its fixed leg, the line where it had broken and been healed. She traced the scar with one finger. This horse lost a leg once. People thought it would never stand again. But here it is. The room was silent. You know, she said, glancing at each of them, there are things in this world that look like they're gone. People, memories, hope. But they're not always lost. Some of them are just waiting. Her eyes found the youngest boy curled into the corner of his chair, hugging his knees to his chest. He was staring at the horse like it might suddenly move. She leaned forward. There are people who think they're broken too, she said. Like this horse was. But even broken things can be mended, especially when someone believes in them. The fire cracked and a few of the children flinched, but they didn't take their eyes off her. Ellie held the horse close now. In the end, she whispered, the boy didn't need to ride the horse anymore. He became it. Strong, kind, always moving forward. She stood up, and the room followed her with their gaze. And then she said clearly, calmly, "Some things we thought were lost are really just waiting for us to find them again." The rain began just after dusk, a soft patter at first, gentle, like a lullaby on the roof. Ellie stood alone in her room, brushing her fingers over the spine of a book on her shelf. The horse rested beside the window, now silhouetted against the night. She stepped closer. The rain traced lines down the glass. Beyond it, the trees swayed under the weight of water. The moon broke through the clouds just enough to cast a silver light over the world, and the horse, sitting quiet, unmoving, caught that light in its glass eyes. It shimmered, just slightly. Ellie leaned her head against the window pane. She watched the shadow the moonlight cast the horse, yes, but more than that. The light bent in such a way that the shadow stretched elongated across the windowsill and onto the floor legs, lifted head forward. A gallop, a motion, a promise. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the hush of the storm, something old exhaled, and something new was born. That concludes the full 960-word sequence for the final story beat. If you'd like, I can now assemble everything into a full treatment or screenplay draft. Just say the word.